Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Greg Eghigian. He is professor of history at Pennsylvania State University in the US, a historian of both the human sciences and modern Europe. He is particularly interested in how societies grapple with the questions and problems associated with modernity through the vehicles of science, technology, and medicine. His research has largely focused on the nature of power and the relationship between the state, science, and medicine in understanding and managing things such as disability, deviance, criminality, mental illness, and security. And he regularly writes articles and presents papers on the general history of madness and psychiatry. In recent years, his interests have moved into studying the history of supernatural and paranormal phenomena. So, Dr. Eghigian, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure here is mine as well.
Okay, so we're going to focus our conversation today on the history of mental illness and psychiatry. So my first question would be, because I think it's important for us to get this straight from the very beginning of our conversation. When we talk about the history of mental illness, or you talk about it in your work, uh, how do you think about mental illness? Is it something that we should look at through the lenses of our present day modern psychiatry? I mean, when you look back in history, how do you classify something as a mental illness? Do you care about how it was classified back then, whenever it is, or do you think that we should be, let's say, from an historical perspective, a little bit anachronistic and look at things as we see it nowadays?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think that it seems to me that there are, and I think most historians sort of have this attitude about almost any topic, that there are dangers in applying our standards, our measures, our values to the past certainly doing so in a facile way. There are lots of pitfalls with that. And I think the primary one is in doing so, we simply get things wrong. There is a tendency when we do those things to look on people in the past and say, well, the reason they did what they did is they were just ignorant. They were too stupid. They were too biased, too lost. And it sort of implies that therefore we don't have biases. We don't get things wrong. We know we do. So that's, I think, a major danger. So I think what I would say, though, is I think there's a way that one can effectively integrate these two kinds of perspectives. I think, first of all, it's absolutely critical in taking societies in history seriously on their terms. So yes, when one first starts out, the importance, I think thing to do is to ask oneself, how did that particular society or that community or that group or that individual define and think of madness? Think of it. What did they contrast it with? How did they understand it to play out? Did they have ideas that this is something that needed to be treated in some way? And if so, how did they treat it, and on what basis did they treat it? So I think that's essential. On the other hand, I think you can, in fact, say to yourself, I'm also interested, however, in our perspective today. Might we be able to put that into the conversation as well? And by doing so, find new aspects, new dimensions to the way in which people did things in the past, right? Maybe understanding that maybe what they were dealing with was this kind of disorder rather than what they thought they were doing. But it also allows us to then reflect back on ourselves, to ask questions about our standards, our diagnostic criteria.
Mm-hmm. And when we are talking about mental illness from an historical perspective, I mean, is there any particular period or time in history where people were already talking about behaviors or some sort of psychological disorder that they would consider a mental illness? I mean, is there a particular point in time where the history of mental illness starts? I mean, that people identify some sort of set of behaviors, for example, as mental illness?
I don't think there is a beginning. No, I think it's fair to say that some conception of what we would call mental illness, what historically, at least in the Western world, has historically been understood as madness, and all the different versions and variations of that term. It goes as far back as recorded history, and indeed, there is evidence. Some folks who work in anthropology have made some, I think, pretty compelling arguments that we see not only evidence of mental illness in mammals, particularly in primates, but that we also see evidence of caretaking by members of animal communities trying to care for and look after their fellow animals that are suffering from one of these things. So there seems to be evidence that in fact, madness and mental illness is universal. It's always been there. What changes are the ways in which it's perceived, the way in which it's dealt with and understood. One of the more intriguing questions in this regard, though, that dovetails with what you're saying, is a question that has come up perennially in the history of psychiatry, which is, are there disorders that come into being that didn't exist before? Are there disorders that are new, that never existed before? And if so, why do they emerge, right? So, for instance, people have asked that question about schizophrenia. Is schizophrenia something that dates back to the most ancient of times, or is it in fact an illness or a disorder that just first emerges in, say, the 19th and 20th century? These are kind of open questions.
Mm-hmm. But when you mention the emergence of a particular mental illness, are you suggesting that it's possible that there are mental illnesses that only existed from a certain point in our history onward? Like, I mean, you were mentioning schizophrenia that started last century, basically. I mean, is it possible that people before the 1920s or 1930s didn't suffer from schizophrenia?
There is a legitimate debate about those things, and one of the things that makes this challenging, I always say to people, one of the real challenges of the history of madness and mental illness and mental health is you're always dealing with a moving target. That is to say that there's an argument that a famous philosopher by the name of Ian Hacking has made, who talks about illnesses, particularly certain kinds, but illnesses in general, exist in what he calls ecological niches. And that is to say that they are always sort of invariably conceived of and understood as part of, as a kind of a package, if you will. They are enveloped in all sorts of cultural assumptions and ideas. And so we give them certain names, and those things become entities that we think exist inside the human beings. But in fact, what they are is they carry with them all sorts of other assumptions. So we could sit there and make an argument, say, about certain kinds of disorders and say they've always been around. Hysteria, what's often referred to as a conversion disorder today. Hysteria has a very long history, but I think it's very difficult to say hysteria in the ancient period was the same as hysteria, say, in the 18th century. And you could say this about a number of other disorders. Moreover, you have these kind of interesting things where there are diseases that come and go and leave. We have seen the disappearance of certain diseases. And you can make an argument they left because we cured them, but that doesn't tend to hold a lot of water. Homesickness, for instance, the phenomenon of homesickness. Homesickness was, in fact, in the 19th century, was itself considered a disease. Nostalgia was considered an actual disease. But these get written out of the diagnoses and the manuals and the handbooks over the course of the modern period. So I think it's fair to say that we always have to ask ourselves, are we looking at the same thing? Are we looking at the same thing? A very common argument too is, for instance, the phenomenon that we call today depression. Our concept of depression is a 20th century invention. It's a 20th century conception of a certain kind of way of dealing with certain moods, particularly moods that we associate now with things like sadness, right? Loneliness. Not only was that not the original meaning of depression, depression by the people who first adopted in the 20th century, really what they meant was you are depressed in the kinds of activities, you lack a certain kind of motivation and a certain ability to act on your motives, right? A lack of energy, that's what it was meant as. But many people want to trace the idea that depression as we know it always existed, but it used to be called melancholia, right? Well, the problem with that is if you look at the history of how societies and how observers describe the phenomenon of melancholia from the ancient period through the medieval and the early modern period, the way they describe melancholia doesn't really look a lot like depression. So were they looking at a totally different illness, or did they put the pieces together in a very different way based on their kinds of conceptions of how things, what categorical affinities existed according to them? That becomes the sort of challenge that you have in trying to address these questions. Did this particular disease always exist or didn't it?
Yeah, but are you just saying that, for example, if we are talking about a particular disease like schizophrenia, depression, that before the 20th century, for example, people, had the same sort of mental experiences, the same sort of symptoms, let's say, and the same set of behaviors that nowadays, if we identify them in a particular person, we say that she suffers from depression or schizophrenia or whatever. They have those sorts of things, but they were not classified as a mental illness? Or are you also saying that there are particular illnesses that require certain cultural contexts to exist? And there are certain mental experiences that people only have in certain cultural contexts.
Yeah. So this really gets at the heart of it. It's a really good line of questioning, I think. And what it gets at is that psychiatry, and not only that, but the experience of grappling with mental illness are both embedded in society, in culture. You cannot avoid it. We don't exist in vacuums, and diseases don't exist in vacuums. And so there's always overlaid on top of this, superimposed on top of it, in fact, not only superimposed on top of it, actually permeating the very experience, the very way we talk about it, are going to be the elements that comprise the society and culture in which one lives. It is very, very difficult. We try it all the time as historians of this field to tease out what are the elements that are kind of universal, right, in the phenomenon that we would call a mental illness of some kind, that we would recognize a mental illness, and what elements are really part of the grammar of a society, of a particular society. We don't have a science to be able to figure out which of those elements are more in play in any given situation. It's very, very clear that, for instance, I think, though, that we can say fairly conclusively, right, that something like antisocial personality disorder is highly, highly culturally contingent. It is very inflected and informed by cultural norms of our society today that would probably be, I would make an argument, are unlikely to be intelligible to somebody, say, in the medieval world or the ancient world. On the other hand, take something like epilepsy. I think it's fair to say epileptic seizures have very little cultural content to them, right? Epileptic seizures look the same across societies over time, right? They are universal in that regard. So we could talk about certain kinds of brain injuries, right? Would be a similar kind of thing. So it is not, I would not argue that all of this stuff is culturally and socially constructed. No, there are, in fact, I think, real clear indications and signs that are universal or darn near universal that comprise up the core of certain disorders. But but we also have to recognize that while all disorders are navigated and dealt with in particular locations, in particular times, and many disorders that have been talked about and described really are more or less going to be informed by and colored by that kind of social context.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And so we've already talked about how we should look at mental illness from an historical perspective, and the fact that we should be a little bit careful when looking back, because we might be projecting some of our cultural elements, let's say, into how people thought about mental illness and if certain behaviors were considered mental illnesses or not. So, another question is, if, for example, people look back in time and they see that that people that wrote books, for example, or left written records, talked about a particular set of behaviors, or that certain people behaved in certain ways, that nowadays, if someone has those behavioral traits, we say that she is mentally ill. Should we think that back then that constitutes evidence that back then that mental illness also existed?
If I understand you right, what you're asking is if we have in the historical record evidence that somebody was flagged as suffering from mental illness, should we accept that? Should we? And if that's the question, I don't think we do. No, not at all. We don't have to accept that. What becomes intriguing for the historian is to first of all ask ourselves, why was that judgment being passed on that individual, right? Who is passing that judgment on the individual? Was this just one writer? Was that writer, for instance, invoking conventional wisdom? Was that writer, in fact, saying, oh, this institution made that decision and I agree with that? So that becomes kind of part of the puzzle for the historian, is to then ask ourselves, that it's to say to ourselves, this may be more reflective of the individual making the judgment than it is of the individual being judged, right? And in history, again, it depends on the source material. As we get into the modern era, when we have lot more source material to work with, it becomes easier, or at least it can be easier, to start to decide whether that judgment that writer made about somebody being mentally ill might in fact be a set of other circumstances at work, rather than an actual bona fide clinical judgment with integrity. But by and large, for a lot of the period of times that you would look at in the ancient or medieval or early modern world, we don't have a lot more evidence than just those writers. And so the best we can do is to say to ourselves, there does seem to be some elements in a description of cases that, say, an ancient physician was working with, that we can go and look at and say, you know, it's clear across many sources, we're seeing doctors from various schools of thought all saying, these are the kinds of things that this person exhibits. That gives us a sense that more than one person makes these judgments, and at least gives us a sense of, now we're starting to see why it is that they not only thought that this was odd behavior, strange, unusual, unconventional, but behavior that they believe must be linked somehow to a pathology, right? That made it into not just eccentricity, but outright mental illness. So that becomes the kind of way we start to make those judgments and start to ask the question. I know it's a long roundabout way of addressing your question, but that's kind of how we work. Yeah.
Yeah, these are very complicated questions. And when we, let's say if that someone is reading a book written hundreds of years ago, and where, I mean, someone is describing the behavior of a particular important person, let's say, I mean, is it academically rigorous for someone in our modern times to try to diagnose someone that no longer exists with some sort of mental illness with what's described on a particular piece of text?
Yeah. Yeah, the question of retrospective diagnosis is an issue that comes up not just in the history of psychiatry, it's also a challenge in the history of medicine in general. It has been a way of analyzing the history of medicine for quite some time, basically since the history of medicine has existed. People have done it, people continue to do it. There can be, I think, really interesting and I think by and large historically sound ways to do that. If you have enough evidence to work with. I'm thinking right away, for instance, of some really good books that have been done, for instance, on the figure of Adolf Hitler, and looking at him from a health perspective. The reason we can do that is we have access to Hitler's doctors, and particularly his personal physician, who is doing a lot of work with him over the years, particularly toward the end of his life. So we have some pretty good evidence, for instance, that a guy like Hitler at the end of his life was suffering from Parkinson's, and it was getting worse over the time. We know he was on a number of different drugs. So you can start to do some things with that, though I don't tend to agree with people who want to therefore then say, these things explain why he was doing the things he was doing. I think we can see that ideology explained more about what horrible things Hitler did than those things. But the problem is on the other hand, when we look at in settings where the figure, we have very little evidence to go on, then that kind of retrospective diagnosis seems to me to come up and fall really, really short. I like to, as a kind of an exercise with students, I often will sit there and ask them to look at the case of something like, story, for instance, the Hebrew Bible, the Bible, right, has, and the Old Testament has numerous stories of kings who were deemed to have been mad. And we look at those kinds of things and the behavior, and we try to talk about, when we look at it, well, what exactly is the reason why people at the time seem to have thought the person was mad? Well, the problem you have when you deal with these sources is, first of all, the sources aren't reliable. These are not texts that were written to be clinical. These are theological texts. They are part of a religious set of stories that are supposed to be educational. So they're not intended to be clinically sound. So secondly, of course, the texts tend to be written hundreds, if not thousands of years sometimes after the person lived. So we don't know how reliable those people telling the stories are. And then moreover, as other historians have pointed out, when you deal with the lives of, say, kings, right, and great leaders, is it any wonder that they act bombastic, expansive, try to kill people, shout and yell? No, this is the way in which kings and queens and lords and rulers of the world are used to do it. They tend to be surrounded by a lot of yes people who allow them a lot of leeway. So they're subject to tantrums and things. And so I think, therefore, to go back and do retrospective diagnosis on people like that in a sort of facile, simplistic way seems to me to inevitably fall short of a really interesting and, I think, historically grounded analysis that really ends up lacking in the end.
Mm-hmm. So we've already talked about how the way we classify mental illnesses as an element of culture to it. Does it also have a political element or not? I mean, I'm asking basically if sometimes, at least, when we say that something is a mental illness, that it also might serve a political purpose because we are basically saying that people who exhibit a particular set of behaviors are not part of the normal range of psychological variation, let's say, and they are in a sort of way, deviant.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question, right, that I think from our perspective today and the way that we utilize and use the term political in the way that you just described it, I think you have to say that mental illness and the way it has been handled by society in general and communities, but also then specifically by the caretakers and healers who tended to be the ones who cater to these people, that relationship is very much informed by politics, but it is a political issue, meaning power is involved, right? When you label somebody, you create a certain identity for them that they then have to live with, and that other people treat them through that sort of label. So that's part of it. Part of it too is, of course, the way in which then societies deal with people with mental illness. You know, when you look in the modern period, say, once we get into the 19th century, you have facilities designed to confine people, sometimes against their will, not always, but sometimes against their will. It's hard not to see that as anything but political. And of course, the anti-psychiatry movement that emerges in the second half of the 20th century specifically talks about that very dimension of things. But we can also see politics exercised in other ways. I mean, I think the obvious ones are cases in the 20th century like the Nazi Germany, where of course Nazi Germany adopted an approach that understood mental illness in eugenic, what they called race hygienic terms. They viewed it as a dangerous corruption of the hereditary stock of Aryan people. And so they adopted a highly politicized view that what they needed to do is eliminate these people from society, first by sterilizing them, and then secondly, by outright killing them. And they end up killing several 100,000 mentally ill children, men and women. The Soviet Union, we know, particularly starting around, it appears to be in the 1960s through the 1980s, imprisoned and confined people in asylums who were not suffering from mental illnesses, but were political dissidents. So those are the most glaring examples of that. But we could, I think, equally sit there and say that, well, it's equally a political, a highly political aspect that could be flagged when you look at something like community mental health or social psychiatry after World War II. The idea that what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the asylums, we're going to release people into society, and allow them to have far more leeway and liberty than they had confined behind the walls of an asylum. That is not just simply depoliticizing something. It's a new kind of politics, right? It is a politics built on the idea that now we're going to leave you on your own. You're not our responsibility anymore. And that, as we know, creates all sorts of new challenges for people dealing with mental illness who then lack resources because no institution wants to take charge or offer them the kinds of things that they need. So I think you can see these political dimensions, as you're calling them, throughout the entire history of mental health and mental health care.
Yeah, so I have this question saved for later, but since you mentioned the Soviet Union, I'm going to pose it now. So back in 2002, if I'm not mistaken, you wrote a provocative article asking if there was ever a communist or Soviet psychiatry. What do you wanted to mean back then when you were asking that? Were you really seriously considering that there was a Soviet or communist psychiatry back then? Or were you simply trying to raise awareness of certain problems within psychiatry and bring certain questions to the table?
Yeah, I think really what I was interested in, yes, it was meant provocatively, but really what it was a desire for us to be more careful about the way we think about these things when we invoke history, and specifically, you know, we could make the same question. I had just mentioned Nazi Germany, right? We can talk about psychiatry at that time. When we talk about it, what do we call it? Do we call it Nazi psychiatry? Do we call it German psychiatry under the Nazis? Or do we simply call it, this was psychiatry in Germany at the time, right? What you call it becomes kind of important. And the same thing was true when I was talking about communism, specifically in East Germany. When the term communist psychiatry is thrown out there, it implies that all of psychiatry was informed by communism, that a distinctly communist psychiatry had been invented and was taking the place of, I guess, some other kind of psychiatry, whatever that was, right? And so I wanted to ask myself and then pose the question for other people in turn. Is that the best way to talk about this? Just what was the impact of communism specifically on psychiatry in a place like East Germany after World War II? And what I found was when you start to dig and look into it, what you find is that no, there really wasn't some overbearing kind of Stalinist, communist ideology that was determining what psychiatry was in East Germany. But rather what you saw was that the Communist Party and the Communist state and its ideas, its concerns had an impact on mental health, but it did so to varying degrees in different sorts of parts of the psychiatric network and mental health care. So for instance, the Communist Party and communist ideology, for instance, had a very deep impact on East German psychiatry when it came to things like career advancement. It was important to be closely tied to the party and the party line. Efforts to Sovietize research along the lines of Pavlov, the banning of psychoanalysis. These were part and parcel of the canon of communism at the time. Then there were these kinds of things where the political realities of the time had more of an impact than just simply communist ideology. So for instance, you had, for instance, the occupation of the Red Army in the 1940s. You had the kind of the brain drain, the large numbers of segments of the mental health community leave East Germany and go to the West. You have the fiscal meltdown of the 1980s. These had direct impacts on personnel, on resources, on things like that. So these are less to do with the communist ideology than they had to do with the political state realities. And then there were things that had virtually nothing to do with party politics. The wrestling with the Nazi past, the reliance increasingly on biological psychiatry at the time, the expanding role of psychiatric professionals as as health experts for the state. These are things you would have seen in other countries at the time. These were international developments. So as you can see, what I was saying was that be careful about just throwing that adjective around and thinking that has no impact on my analysis. By doing so, it means what we're missing are the nuances, or the many levels and ways in which even an overbearing political set of authorities, as the Communist Party was at the time, even though you're in that kind of setting of that kind of authoritarian society, you still see there are ways in which there's all sorts of other developments that have lesser or more sort of relationships, or more intimately or less intimately tied to those kinds of authorities and their institutionalized power.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is right or not, but I mean, thinking about the former Soviet Union, and also considering people like, for example, Lysenko, that have a big impact on agriculture, that was basically Lamarckian. I mean, isn't it the case that in that sort of political context, people were trying to push for views that were environmentalistic? I mean, psychologically speaking, that it was sort of extreme environmentalism back then. And we mentioned Pavlov, for example. He was a behaviorist because, I mean, in the Soviet Union, they basically fought, and this was derived from their political ideology, that individuals could be completely molded by society, by culture, by politics, and biology didn't matter that much. And nowadays, at least in Western society, we have more of a biopsychosocial model of mental illness, right?
Yeah. You're quite right that official doctrine, particularly in the Stalin years, and then even over the course of the Khrushchev years, I think you'd have to say that there tended to be a pretty dogmatic, at least like I say, in terms of official doctrine, dogmatic stance about human psychology. And you're quite right. You see this in the Eastern Bloc in the late 1940s and the 1950s. This kind of insistence that virtually not just mental illness, but frankly, all sorts of social problems could be solved simply by changing, right, the nature of the division of labor, by changing labor relations, by altering the economy, right? That environment was the key driver of change in human society and in human beings. And there is, I think, what we see when I look at it, I'll talk specifically here in this instance primarily about East Germany. There is a lot of expansive utopian talk in the 50s, just along those lines. What's really interesting, though, is for all the bluster and all the talk about this, when you look at what happened on the ground, what literally was happening in the hospitals and clinics, that stuff just doesn't have any impact on how people were concretely dealing with mental illness and with the mentally ill in those kinds of medical facilities. This is, for instance, the case we know too with Pavlov. That Moscow becomes very, very keen on people, on research centers and all sorts of sort of life science centers and academies to really adopt the Pavlovian view of things. And what we see in the medical setting is that researchers will often pay lip service to it. They'll make some, early on in an article, they'll make some gestures towards Pavlov, and then what they do is they just went on and wrote their stuff up, and they just kind of ignored it. Pavlov and Pavlovian research has virtually no significant, certainly no lasting impact in a place like East Germany on psychiatry. It's seen as an imposition largely, but by and large by practitioners. And so there is this talk, you see this, and this is such a common thing as anyone who studies the history of Soviet style communism, this disconnect between the official conversation about stuff and then what went on in the ground. And what went on in the ground, at least in a place like East Germany, was this stuff largely really fell on deaf ears. And people simply just kept going with the style of psychiatry that had come to take shape in Germany at that time. And what was that? It was biological psychiatry. That's what dominated the scene in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah. And talking specifically about pre-modern times, but I mean, what were some of the approaches that people had back then to try to deal with or treat mentally ill people? Because when we look back in history, I guess that most people would imagine that people who had this sort of abnormal behaviors would be confined or sedated, or even in extreme cases burned at the stake or killed in any sort of way, because people thought they were possessed by demons or whatever. I mean, I'm not sure if you want to focus your answer only in Western Europe or in other parts of the globe as well, but there were also other approaches, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What I think it's often forgotten is that confinement is a modern approach to the phenomenon, right? The first madhouses seem to have developed only first around the 14th century. And from about the 14th through the 18th century, madhouses were primarily, almost exclusively, there's some exceptions, but almost exclusively for the indigent, for the poor, for the homeless. And they did not cater to the general population. People would never want to go to one of those places anyway, and they didn't offer much by any way of form of treatment. They therefore were not very ubiquitous. They were the vast majority. I think you can't really put a statistic to it, but I think it's fair to say that well over 90% of the population of people who would have been deemed to have been mad would never have stepped foot in those places. It's only in the 19th century with the invention of the asylum that you start to see large numbers, really big numbers and share of the community of people who are suffering from mental illnesses being confined in facilities either voluntarily or involuntarily. So what did people have to offer? Well, in pre-modern times, they had a lot of different things that they could offer people who were suffering from mental illness. For starters, we know, dating back to the very earliest records we have, and this is not exactly a phenomenon that's completely gone away, is all sorts of what I think you'd have to call magical treatments, right? Ritualized spells, charms, talismans, amulets of various kinds were used. Music, dating back to the ancient world, was considered to be a form of treatment, particularly for people who were agitated. The belief was that magic was kind of the language of the soul. Music was upheld as having a special kind of status linked to the divine. And because mental illnesses were seen, particularly in Western society, from ancient times up until really the 18th and 17th centuries, was considered to be primarily a disease that disturbed the soul, the spirit of the individual. It was incredibly important to, in fact, reach the soul in some ways. You had ceremonies of various kinds. The ancient Greeks, for instance, and the Romans utilized this as well. Temples to the god Asclepius, right? These temples where what you would do is you would go into the temple and go through an elaborate ritual in which you would sleep and then dream in the temple. And then Asclepius would visit you in your dreams. You'd wake up, and you therefore then would have some kind of priest who would aid you in interpreting the dream in how to help you deal with the particular illness you're dealing with here. But by far the most common form of treatment in the ancient and medieval and early modern periods is really going to be treatments to deal with what were believed to be unbalanced humors, right? The humoral theory of medicine dominates the scene for centuries. This idea, right, that we are composed of four basic humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And the problem is that all illnesses, including mental illnesses, are due to some kind of imbalance in these humors in the body. And so what you would have to do is resolve that kind of imbalance by putting the body back in balance using the principle of allopathy, the principle typically of opposites. Are you too cold, or is a part of your body too cold? Make it warm, right? That kind of thing. You also would use devices like cupping, for instance, right? Heating these porcelain or glass cups, right? Placing them on the body, right? On a certain body part, they create blisters. You then take the cups away. The blisters would then be pierced. And the idea is you would be drawing out the bad humors in that fashion. So all of these were sort of possibilities that were out there. They were seen as more or less successful. And a clever physician's job was, skilled physician's job was to know which was the right sort of tool to use in any particular given situation. So they had both, as you can see, most of these things weren't terribly invasive. This is not an age that tends to adopt kinds of more invasive approaches, though we do know that going back to even prehistoric times, there seems to be some evidence that trepanning, right, trepanning the skull, drilling holes in the skull, was sometimes used, but this was not done to do brain surgery. This typically looks to have been done to relieve pressure from people who had collected blood under the cranium, right? And that was the major issue there. So you do have a kind of a wide variety of options in these earlier periods.
Mm-hmm. So as far as we know, did people in all societies, at least the ones that have written records, believe that the people they think were mentally ill would be able to be cured? I mean, were curative approaches always a possibility, always on the table, or did people in certain instances think that if someone suffered from a mental illness, they would always be like that?
Yeah. So what is clear is that dating back to the ancient period, right on through to the present day, I think, it's fair to say that those community of professionals, typically doctors, but not just doctors, healers of all kind, tended to agree on one basic point, that you were going to confront people who were curable, people who were treatable, and people who were incurable. There was no sort of beating around the bush. They clearly thought you would encounter plenty of people who could not be cured. That was not a kind of a source for embarrassment or anything. It was just believed that was the nature of the thing. There were different settings and different times with different disorders going to be schools of thought or medical people who firmly believed that certain kinds of things they were confronting were curable, and that they had in fact cured people of various diseases. And there's a wide range of these kinds of things. You have people, for instance, in World War I, treating shell shock victims who are claiming to have 100% success rate, a 100% curative rate for their kinds of treatments for shell shock. Mind you, they never did any long-term follow-up studies to determine whether that was true. You have, for instance, in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, the emergence of this new kind of treatment that was referred to as the moral treatment, really sort of crusaded for by a fellow in England by the name of Francis Willis, and in France by Philippe Pinel. And they are very, very convinced that they can effectively treat most all patients, most all mentally ill patients under their care, using a kind of a combination of what we would have to call sort of talk therapy and behavioral modification of various kinds. And they were incredibly optimistic about it. And so were the founders, the early founders of asylums in the early 19th century were equally, very, very optimistic that they were inventing an institution that held the promise of definitively treating, if not curing, the vast majority of people who went there. So optimism is out there at times, but it's oftentimes followed by periods of pessimism. When it's found out that these things don't have the impact people had hoped for, you often then see this kind of throwing up of the hands, metaphorically speaking, and a clinician saying, we really are lost. We really don't know what to do now. And that's usually a period when you start seeing people seeking out new kinds of methods, new sort of innovations to adopt.
Mm-hmm. Historically speaking, were mentally ill people always stigmatized? I mean, of course, we could argue that nowadays they are still stigmatized. I mean, we tend to think that we are a little bit more tolerant of people than earlier in history, let's say, but were people always stigmatized in some way? Do we know anything about it?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that mental illness has always been associated with stigma. It is not to say that there aren't instances where that experience and that identity might not be somewhat greeted with perhaps a little more understanding, more or less, or even sort of exalted in some ways, extolled in some ways. So take, for instance, the ancient world, right? In the ancient world, the ancient Greeks, for instance, were firmly believed that madness was a fate worse than death. They considered it a horrible, horrible state to be in, primarily because the ancient Greeks tended to highly prize the value of rationality and reason. And from their standpoint, madness was exactly the opposite of that. So to lose your reason, your faculty of reason, was to be seen as succumbing to a state that was humiliating, dishonorable, demeaning in some fashion. That said, on the other hand, when you look at like the early Jewish traditions, we know that in those traditions, madness and in fact the language of madness was deeply connected with the language and the discourse about prophecy. And in fact, you get oftentimes this idea that madness and prophecy share a boundary, that in fact, prophecies and prophets look like madmen, and madmen look like prophets. And in fact, it becomes kind of sometimes a difficult thing to decipher whether the person you are facing before you is in fact an out-and-out prophet, or in fact is somebody suffering from some mental illness.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I was just thinking that many times, at least, I mean, there are behaviors that are recorded or that have been observed, for example, in more traditional societies like hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, where, I mean, if they were to occur in modern society, we would probably classify them as some sort of mental illness, the ones associated with shamans and people like that. So, I mean, Possibly there were instances where people that had those sorts of behaviors, I mean, could be mentally ill, but their mental illness was, I mean, directed towards certain roles in society.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's a question of can you find a way, or does society offer ways and recognize ways for people to channel these sorts of behaviors into avenues that are seen as valuable, as seen as prized in some way? And if that's the case, then oftentimes it's either sort of accepted as I used the term before, as a mere eccentricity, or even more so, it can be even admired. It can be extolled in some fashion. So it all depends on that. But that said, I think it's really fair to say that by and large, those suffering from mental illness have tended to find themselves being singled out for exclusion. They tend to be marginalized historically, understood to be less valued members of society for one reason or another. And that of course has become the added burden, the added emotional burden that mentally ill people have had to deal with over the course of their lives, is not only grappling with these experiences that are so difficult, so troubling, create so much suffering in their lives, it's then compounded by the way in which society has often dealt with them.
Mm-hmm. From a historical perspective, when can we start talking about psychiatry? I mean, for example, you mentioned the theory of humors developed by Hippocrates and others. Was that already something that we consider to be psychiatry, or did psychiatry only develop more recently in history?
Psychiatry is really, as a formal field, is really, from a historical standpoint, a relatively new field. The term is only first invented in the early 19th century. The same with psychotherapy. It too is a term that derives from the early 19th century. Psychiatry, understood as a field in which medically trained people who are specialists in treating disorders of the mind, right, is itself a concept that only starts to develop in the first half of the 19th century. For most of Western history, at least, there really aren't people who specialize in the field of mental disorders. You mentioned Hippocrates, for instance. The ancient physicians did not tend to specialize in this area. They were general practitioners. And so dealing with these things would be, you deal with that one day, and the next day, for all you know, you're helping to set a bone for somebody, or dealing with a skin rash of someone. The first specialists who really start to emerge, we tend to recognize as emerging in the 18th century, so-called mad doctors, they were called, and they called themselves that. Who specialized specifically in dealing with these disorders of the mind. And they become kind of the first sort of generation of people who make it a point to study this phenomenon as a distinctive phenomenon in and of itself, and then to also treat it at facilities that they tend to run. And then what happens in the 19th century is you basically see kind of two different pathways emerge. You have on one hand the formal psychiatrists, and I would also throw in there neurologists, by the way, who are going to come out of the realm of medical training, medical schools, who specialize in this and then go on to typically work at hospitals or clinics of some kind, or do outpatient work. On the other hand, you then have another group who have more in common with the old mad doctors, who are going to be trained in a variety of ways. Some come out of being ministers or priests, some are educators, some are doctors as well. And they become the people who populate the asylums. And they are referred to as alienists, right? These are the alienists. And so in the 19th century, you get these two communities who are working sort of parallel to one another. They end up not entirely being on the same page as one another. They have very different approaches, and over time there actually are conflicts between these two groups. And it basically gets resolved in favor of the psychiatrists. In the end, the alienists fall by the wayside in the early part of the 20th century, and psychiatry comes to dominate after that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned neurologists at a certain point there. Was it that since the early days of psychiatry, people thought of mental illnesses as diseases of the brain, or is that more recent?
It was, the brain was always, dating back to the ancient world, was always a part of the discussion. That is not to say that everybody agreed that the brain was the source of the problem. You have plenty of debate and discussion of this issue. Many medical experts and philosophers believe the heart was the key element. In other instances, as we talked about humoral theory, the argument was that because you understood this notion that the humors were essentially the key component, the key element in all of this, then what you have to do is locate where in the body the humors were out of balance, and that becomes the critical thing. So the brain was certainly talked about, discussed, recognized by many to be a key element in all of this, played some role for some people. Others believed it was the central role in all of this. But over time, the brain becomes ever more important. And what really becomes important by the time we get into the 17th and 18th centuries is really the study of the entire nervous system. The focus on the entire nervous system, with the brain, of course, being the key element in that, becomes really the focus of a lot of research, a lot of discussion. And that's where you start to see this emphasis on trying to look at neuroanatomy as holding the key to all of this. And this is what leads to the explosion of neurology as a field in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now talking specifically about a very specific behavior that is suicide. I mean, it's not in and of itself a mental illness. It's mostly a symptom, or is considered a symptom of mental illness. But how was it viewed throughout history? I mean, how did people think about suicide and about people who committed suicide, and also perhaps people that had suicidal ideation?
Yeah. So suicide was looked at dating back to the ancient period right on through, you could argue it even is the case today, was thought of primarily or chiefly, or in some ways even at times exclusively, as a moral question. It was a morality question. It was a question about ethics and moral values. In ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, it was debated. There was a debate about it. It was understood as a moral question, but there was some level of debate about, could it be at times moral to commit suicide, right? Most famous case, of course, being Socrates, right? Mm-hmm. But by the Middle Ages, European Christianity and Christian thinkers start to step into this, and they end up agreeing with St. Augustine that suicide was an inherently immoral act. And the reason it was believed to be immoral is that it represented a refusal to submit to God's will. God gave you life. It is up to you to fulfill your mission in life, no matter what. You don't get to decide when you die. God gets to decide that. And so it's not surprising that, therefore, it was talked about in Christian Europe as referred to and talked about as quote unquote self-killing. And so people who committed suicide in the medieval and early modern period, their bodies were desecrated. Their possessions were taken from them after their deaths. What we see is that over the course of the 16th and the 18th century, so around that period of time, things start to change. We see philosophers beginning to discuss suicide as justified, perhaps, in some sort of circumstances. And more importantly, we see civil and church courts beginning to decriminalize suicide. And in the 18th century, you get reformers who begin to talk about suicide not as a moral failing per se, but now as really a reflection, the result of kind of deep emotions and deep emotional problems like grief and things like that. So it's in the 19th century then that we start to see this real major shift during this period of secularization, right? We get these two groups of scholars who now began to take up the topic. On one hand, you had doctors in the medical community. On the other hand, you had social scientists like sociologists. The doctors viewed this from a clinical perspective, and they increasingly start to talk about suicide as deriving from some sort of psychopathology, that suicide is now a symptom of other kinds of problems, of typically emotional disorders. And the sociologists, on the other hand, start to talk about it because in epidemiological ways. What they do is they start to look for statistical patterns, regularities, trends that might be reflective of other kinds of social dislocations. So the sociologists start to ask, well, do suicide rates change when you have civil wars or when you have an economic downturn? So by the end of the 19th century, you get these two sorts of discussions going on. But what everybody agreed with at the time was that suicide had reached an almost epidemic level. There was this great concern by observers that suicide had become almost a pandemic. And they couldn't understand it. They were utterly baffled by it and perplexed by it. But it's then you get, after that sort of period of time, you get into the 20th century. And the 20th century is when you start to see a kind of more of a public health perspective. Eugenics plays a role in that, to be sure, but the focus that you have, say, today, where the idea is now preventive mental health, identify populations who are at risk, the elderly, adolescents, for instance, being chief among them, finding the signs and signals that are warning signs that somebody might be considering suicide and intervening beforehand to prevent them from committing suicide, right? That becomes the focus. So you see this general sort of, this long shift over time towards the secularization, the demoralization, if you will, and partly the medicalization of suicide over time.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned that aspect, that in the 19th century, people, particularly sociologists, were trying to understand what were the social factors behind suicide. Before the 19th century or even the modern times, did we have a good suicide data? I mean, did people keep registers of the number of suicides? I mean, nowadays we think of things as per 100,000 people, right? Probably back then they didn't do that, but were there any registers kept with that sort of data or not?
Yeah, interesting question. I can't definitively say that there are no records of this kept before the 19th century. But if I had to guess, I would say that by and large, you would find at best spotty records, and more likely the case, very few, if any, records of that thing before the 19th century. And the reason I say this is because we know that records of things like, there are records, of course, in parish records, if you look at a place like England, for instance, right? Things like that. You have this in every society, right? Churches and parishes and keeping records of births and deaths. The question would be, were they keeping track of ones that are done at the hands of suicide, particularly given that suicide was was not only considered immoral, but illegal. I would guess that you would have a lot of people in a family would disguise the suicide, right? You would just say, well, father died of a heart attack and we buried him, right? We don't want to share that with the community. So I would guess that those records might not be terribly reliable. But the reason why I also say that I suspect we wouldn't have a lot to go with is that really these kind of elaborate statistical records about what were called at the time population statistics really are a phenomenon of the maybe the late 17th, but certainly only the 18th century, and only in certain countries. Germany, the Habsburg monarchy, maybe France probably would also be good, but mostly in Central and Western Europe, you do see an effort in the state starting to collect data on the population as a way to inform policy. And health data was one of those things that were kept track of. But that said, that is not a universal phenomenon. And we also know that what they're keeping track of are not necessarily the things they're going to map onto this. So I can't definitively say there are no records like this, but if I had to guess, you wouldn't probably be seeing anything like the kind of accuracy you get with 19th century records.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, earlier we talked about the cultural elements, or perhaps how culture influences how we think about mental illness and the classification systems that we develop, let's say. Since we're now talking about suicide, one thing came to my mind that is, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but I think that there are at least some instances where suicide might also be a cultural phenomenon in a way, because I was thinking about, for example, the Japanese samurai and how they had a code of honor, and if they were dishonored, they basically had to commit what they call the rakiri. So, and it was a form of suicide, or that we would classify as suicide, because at least it was the person taking their own life. So
yeah, there's no question you have to differentiate that. Yeah, the famous 19th and early 20th century sociologist Emil Durkheim talked about this already at that stage, right? When he's a sociologist trying to do this kind of stuff that I was just describing, and writes this very famous book on suicide. And he himself says it's necessary to differentiate some of these motivations and intentions, and talks about this very form of suicide that, for instance, is common among, he says, soldiers, for instance. That is, sacrificing one's life for a greater cause, and that this constitutes something different. And I think historians have in fact looked at this. There are historians, for instance, a couple of good books on the subject of, for instance, suicide in Nazi Germany. We know that a great many of the Nazi leadership committed suicide as the war was ending, not wanting to be taken in the hands of the Allies, but also seeing it as a more honorable way to die, I guess, than probably the inevitable firing squad or lynching that probably would have happened. And in those instances, historians have gone in to try to understand how one would make sense of this relative to the other kinds of forms of suicide that were going on at the time among the general population. So I think there's no question that suicides too are a phenomenon that are going to be shaped by and colored by certain kinds of cultural norms and expectations, and play out that way. There is, and psychologists talk about this, right? People who specialize in the study of suicide, there is a performative quality to suicide, right? There is a way in which it is sometimes, if not oftentimes, an act that carries with it an intention to communicate information and to have some sort of impact on others. And I think that means, therefore, the communicative, performative aspect means it is going to be invariably linked to these other things that you talk about.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with the approach that Michel Foucault had to the history of mental illness, where basically, I mean, we've already talked a little bit about the politics behind mental illness. Do you agree with the bit where, I mean, to put it simply, he says that by labeling someone as mentally ill, society or the political system is exerting a form of power over that person?
People often ask me about this, right? I would first of all state that I might go so far as to say I don't even know the extent to which it would be possible for many of us to do the study of the history of mental illness without the work of Foucault. He's been fundamentally impactful for any of us who work in this area. I would also say that historians, by and large, of the field now agree that a lot of what he sort of argued has some major shortcomings to it. A lot of his timelines, his chronology, his description of things seem now to either be inaccurate or overblown in many ways. And more localized archival studies have revealed way more complexity than he oftentimes, I think, acknowledged. I don't believe that that inherently discredits everything that he was saying by any stretch of the imagination. And I think what you described is, I think, one of those very fundamental aspects of his work that I think are really not arguable. Namely, that within this area, within this phenomenon, right, that we'll just call mental health care, however you want to generically define it, power and knowledge are intimately connected to one another. That we cannot talk about the knowledge about this phenomenon without talking about the power relationships that are involved in creating that knowledge and in excluding some other forms of knowledge. And that you can't talk about power without acknowledging who knows what and about whom, who gets to decide on what constitutes knowledge, who gets to decide what to do once you know something or think you know something. On the base of that knowledge, who gets to decide what's to be done, right? Those things are all intimately connected with one another. So in that regard, I definitely share Foucault's interest in that kind of problematic. That seems a critically important thing to be looking at. I don't think it's the sole thing we need to be looking at, but to me, it's a critically important dimension of the phenomenon that is quite worthy of continuing to investigate the history of psychiatry, the history of mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've already talked about psychiatry. What about talk therapy and psychotherapy? I mean, are those also recent historical phenomena, or was it that before the 19th century there were also societies, places, or people that practice this sort of therapy?
Yeah. Talk therapy, right? If we understand psychotherapy as talk therapy, talk therapy goes back again to the ancient world. It is not a new phenomenon. Yes, the term psychotherapy is a relatively new one. But the idea that communication through the word, through words, could have an impact on one's mental health is something that certainly goes back to the ancient world. I mean, that is, in fact, the core, for instance, of the Greek concept of rhetoric. Rhetoric is all about persuasiveness. And in fact, you have in the Greeks come up with this term called psychagogia. And what psychagogia was it referred to a concept of the notion of guiding the soul towards self-knowledge in some ways. And you did this through the use of persuasion, the use of words. Words had the ability to move the soul, to direct it, to guide it. So in that regard, that's why, for instance, they took seriously the importance of poetry, right? The arts are important because they can move the soul. And you can see, we don't, those of us who love the arts say, I think would also agree that that is true, right? This concept of psychagogia was also folded into interventions for people who were mentally ill. There's a great, wonderful text by a famous physician by the name of Soranus. I can't remember what century. I want to say he's 1st or 2nd century AD, but I might be wrong. But in any event, Soranus talks about, for instance, when he's dealing with cases of people suffering from mania, lays out, he says, here's how I approach it. And he lays out with great specificity how you have to talk to the person. And he says that it has to be timed. You have to talk in certain kinds of ways, avoid certain topics, bring up certain other topics, arrange the room in a certain way, allow the patient, when they're agitated, to only have conversations with certain people. When you talk to them, don't try to upset them too much by telling them they're wrong, but at the same time, don't indulge their hallucinations, right? And as they get better, he says, then what you want to do is maybe have them listen to some poetry or read some philosophy, right? These kinds of things. So you can see already in the ancient period, there is this idea that words can have a profound impact in much the same way that your typical sort of somatic interventions can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting because I mean, there's this idea that is very old, I guess, that if people have to think correctly, clearly, to be able to be mentally healthy, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, right, that's the goal. And the other thing is I guess that's implied in what you're saying is something that, of course, psychotherapists have talked about and people have talked about for quite a long time, is that if you have a patient who is actively psychotic, who may be incapable of holding a conversation, but maybe even incapable of speech, right? Because of the state of mind they're in. What impact can words have, right? That becomes a sort of a long-term discussion that, still exists today. So it's not just that the goal is to get somebody to effectively communicate and use that communication as a way to reach them and to integrate them into society. It's also it's also a hurdle that has to be overcome. And so, for instance, we know that when the first, sort of new generation of drugs that you get in the 1950s, right, get introduced into asylums and mental hospitals in the 1950s, that seem to have a really, really amazing effect on particularly patients suffering from things like schizophrenia. What a lot of the physicians and the administrators talk about that is so wonderful, that they see is so great about it, is that they say, finally now, I can actually now have psychotherapeutic intervention with these patients. These are now patients that are no longer unreachable through the word. Now we can begin the work of psychotherapy, right? So then, in other words, these clinical interventions provide the opportunity to do exactly the thing we've been wanting to do all along, which is talk with them, right? Talk with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And because psychiatry has all of these cultural and political elements that we've been talking about, can we say that it is a science or not?
Boy, that's an interesting question. I would, excuse me. I'm gonna probably disappoint you by answering it from a historical, with a historian's mentality about it, and that is to say that mental health care has been always deeply tied to the history of medicine, not exclusively, but it's played a critical role. The history of medicine in the Western world, at least, has been for most of its history, it was understood as what the Greeks called a techne, an art. It was a skill. It was like the skills of a craftsman, right? It was not a science. It was not understood to be a science. But in time, as we get to around, I would say, the development starts to take place during the Renaissance, but certainly in the 18th and 19th century, you start to see medicine increasingly linked to and tied to science. And science being a field that is much more interested in research, right? Research, empirical-based, evidence-based investigations that are going to inform the clinical interventions. And then you'd start talking about medical science. And medicine becomes, when you get into the late 20th century and 21st century, right, a field now that is almost wholly dominated by scientific research, right? And what science says and what the algorithms of scientific research show. Psychiatry goes through the exact same process. And so from my standpoint, I would say, yes, psychiatry is a science because it follows that historical trajectory. It is an art that is informed by scientific research, but it does find itself, and I think most clinicians I talk to would tell you that do not be fooled in thinking that they've given up on the art part of it. Yeah, there's a lot of art to it. There's a lot of craft to it. There's a lot that's done on the basis of feel, on the basis of experience. And that to me is what's intriguing about it. Psychiatry manages to, I think, really effectively combine the two of those things.
Yeah, right. So let's just cover one last topic. In your work, you talk about the deinstitutionalization of psychiatry. What is that about?
The institutionalization or the deinstitutionalization?
The deinstitutionalization.
Ah, the deinstitutionalization. Yeah. So deinstitutionalization was and has been a process that took place, I think you'd have to say, basically from the 1940s on into roughly the year 2000. So the second half of the 20th century. And basically what it was as a process, it was a process that was begun in some ways unintentionally and then over time became deliberate, which was to derive from the idea that, excuse me,
no problem,
that the asylums, that the building of these enormous structures and the confinement of large segments of the population of the mentally ill in these facilities was no longer serving people, was no longer helping them, that these institutions were warehousing people. Moreover, more people were staying for longer periods of time. And as they stayed for lengthier periods of time in these institutions, they were finding less capable, less able to be integrated into society at large. And so the thought begins to emerge that what we need to do is move away from that model of confinement. And let's try to focus on getting people to stay, by and large, in society by offering them all sorts of resources to do so. Halfway houses, In the United States, they're called community mental health centers, right? Social psychiatry, it's called mostly in Europe, right? And this becomes a new sort of ideal for people, and it gets championed in lots of different countries: Italy, France, Germany, England, the idea that is to move these populations out into society more broadly, more generally, through these resources. And so what happens is it really is not a sudden process. I think a lot of people feel this process that's called deinstitutionalization happened relatively rapidly. It basically happened in fits and starts, slowly, gradually taking place. Begins already, at least in the United States, it begins already in the 40s and 50s, when you have the creation of nursing homes, homes for the elderly. That becomes one of the first ways in which a large segment of long-term patients get moved into these new facilities. That begins the process in the United States of deinstitutionalization. And it takes shape over the course of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, to the point that where we are right now, right, which is in many societies now, the large swath of these asylums are now closed. It now becomes the case that by and large, most facilities do not like the idea of having patients stay for anything longer than several days, if at most perhaps a few weeks. So the long-term sort of care, the long-term stay of residential care has become now the exception and not the rule. And all of that is a function of this process called deinstitutionalization.
So one last question. Do you know if there were any particular reasons for people to create asylums and these places where basically mentally ill people were separate from the rest of society? I mean, was it just that people wanted to have a place where these people that could have abnormal behaviors to put them in a place where they would be separate from the rest of society? Or did people think that these people could be cured of their illnesses? Or, I mean, were there reasons like these back then, or?
Yeah. So the reason for the creation and proliferation of asylums, I would say, there are two key elements to it. One is to, first of all, to recognize that the proponents, the advocates, the crusaders for asylums were deeply, deeply optimistic people. They believed these facilities would be the key to helping these people, to saving them, to treating them. And so asylums, when they get created, they aren't just any kind of institution. The architecture, the design of the facilities was all done expressly, thinking all the time about how the facilities layout would be conducive to treatment, would be conducive to helping people overcome the problems they're dealing with. That's, for instance, why they were put off typically out in pastoral countrysides, to get them away from the hustle and bustle of city life and their families. So there was a very, very clear message being sent by the proponents of these things, that these things are going to hold the key to finally getting our handle on all of this. This was going to create a bold new world because these institutions were effective. The other part of this you got to keep in mind is that from what I've seen, and there may be exceptions in other societies, but most of the societies I'm familiar with and the historical research I've seen indicates that almost all the time, or at least the majority of the time, most people who were sent to asylums were sent there by their families. That is to say, families played the critical role. And the question historians have tried to answer is why? Why were families who never before had sent their mentally ill relatives away, why were families doing this? One reason, of course, could be they believed the advertising, right? That these asylums were going to help their family. But other people have offered up a much more cynical view, which is to say the evidence maybe hints at the fact that families were becoming less tolerant of their mentally ill relatives, that parents were finding their children to be just too much trouble, or children were finding their parents or grandparents to be too difficult to have in the household. And that there had somehow changed over the course of the 19th century a kind of a threshold. It was a lower threshold for tolerance of family members had occurred. It's something we're still working out. We're still debating. I think there's evidence to indicate there's something like that going on. Why that was going on, whether that is a universal phenomenon at this time, all of that I think remains to be seen. But it's clear that to answer the question of why the asylums get built and what was the motivation, you have to look at both the supply and the demand. Why was there a supply? The supply was there because people thought these things were brilliant, were going to be key, but there was also a demand for them. Families were seemingly more interested than ever in getting their family members out of their households. And that becomes, I think, the other part of this as well.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so Dr. Eghigian, let's end the interview here. Before we go, would you like to mention what are some of the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
Oh, my word, on the internet. I'd say a good place to go to see on these kinds of topics is to go visit a site I co-founded, and I'm one of the editors-in-chief at, is a website called H Madness. I think our handle, our URL is historyofpsychiatry.com. And there at H Madness, H-Madness, if you Google that, you'll get to it. It's a place where for now, about 10 years, we've been collecting all sorts of information about articles, books coming out, conferences being held, art exhibits, you name it, anything that's related to the history of madness across the globe. It's an international website. We publish things in multiple languages, and our editorial staff come from all over the world. So it's an exciting place if you're really interested in the history of psychiatry. Highly recommend subscribing to it so that you can keep updated as to what's going on out there.
Okay, great. So I will include that in the links down below in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out, and also links to the rest of your work because it's very, very interesting. And Dr. Eghigian, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a really fun conversation. So thank you.
Oh, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And I would really like to keep doing this in the long run, and so please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, or go to my PayPal links in the description box and you can also make a monthly pledge there, or a one-time big donation, or several times big donations. It's as you prefer. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. Finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and supporters, the main ones: Karen Litska and Blanchett, Parerga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anyan Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollisey, Enrique Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Robert Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, and Dmitry Grigoriev. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, and my executive producers Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.